The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I am your host, Rebecca Larson, and I am here once again at Cadet House in Devon for Wolf Hall weekend, and I am joined by friend of the show, Dr. Elizabeth Norton. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on.
We just kind of talked briefly yesterday. It's nice to finally be able to sit down and have a chat with you.
Yeah, it's great to be in person because obviously, we've known each other for ages, but actually
Yes.
to meet for the first time is lovely.
It is. It's different, isn't it? But
Yeah.
very nice. So today we're going to talk about one of my favorites of Henry VIII's queens, Jane Seymour. And I know I've had you on the show within the last year to talk about her, but you're still doing research and writing another book on her. I would like to know what's different from your first book to this one.
Yeah, so very different is the answer. Partly it's a difference in style. So the first book is obviously a kind of more general book, a bit of an introduction. This one is an academic study, so it's going to be more detailed. But also I've been doing very extensive archival research for it. And what I'm trying to do is, firstly, I'm trying to myth bust because there are lots of myths about Jane. And secondly, I'm really trying to go into as much detail as we possibly can. And there will always be huge gaps in her life. I can't fill them. There are some that I'm going to fess up and say, I can't fill that. But there are so many gaps that I have been able to fill, or I'm in the process of filling, and definitely trying to flesh her out as a much more well-rounded character.
Yeah. Probably the most common thing we hear about her is that she was humble and meek.
Yeah.
Has your impression changed? Is she humble and meek?
I mean, no. She's a businesswoman. She'd be on The Apprentice. She's just in the work that I've been doing on the Queen's lands, because obviously she's an enormous landowner. As soon as she becomes queen, the queens get granted a jointure of lands. They're one of the biggest landowners in the country, although they only have a life interest, which means that when they die, or in Henry's case, they get removed, everything just lapses and goes back to the crown. So they're responsible for administering those lands, and they do to a greater or lesser degree of kind of attentiveness. Jane's very attentive to her lands, and she's an absolute sort of Rottweiler when it comes to kind of chasing down extra profits. And I think it's very telling that Anne Boleyn has quite extensive debts when she dies. They're being paid off for some years. Jane doesn't have any debts. Jane is managing these estates very well.
Where do you think she learned that from?
So, I mean, I do think partly it's background. Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour, on the face of it, have the same background. They're both the daughters of gentlemen, but really that's where the similarities end. The Boleyns are an immensely wealthy family. They have many, many manors. The Seymours, on the other hand, kind of have to make every penny count. They don't have this extensive land holding. So she will have grown up in a household where they are balancing the books and they're trying to get the most money out of their manors. It's a time of sort of enclosure where landlords are trying to get the most money out of their lands. They're trying to get more tenancies in on commercial rates. And she would have seen this at home. And you can see it in her own role as queen when she's taking on the lands.
I often wonder, and I don't know if you can even answer this question, because people always ask, was she like her brothers?
I think she is. I think she is much more similar to her brothers than we tend to give her credit for. Her favourite brother is clearly Henry, or at least he's the one she feels needs the most help, which is a possibility. He's everywhere during her queenship. She's like, I've got a stewardship of a manor I need to appoint. Oh, Henry can do it. Henry can be my bailiff there. After her death, he tends to lose a lot of these appointments. People don't keep him on, which suggests his sister is somewhat propping him up. But I think, I think she's much more similar to Edward and Thomas, I'd say, to some extent, with her ambition. And we can see her ambition, can't we? I mean, you don't go from being, mousy girl from Wiltshire to being Queen of England without being hugely ambitious.
Yeah.
But I think she's also very political. And I think we can again see that in her brothers. I think they're very similar.
I love that you mentioned Henry, because he is never talked about, is he?
No one knows he exists.
No.
People are always surprised.
There's another brother? Yeah, and I'm glad to hear, because I don't know a whole lot about him, but to hear about how much she helped him. So we're going to learn more about him in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. A bit more about Henry. And I mean, actually, he's always portrayed as the least successful Seymour brother. Yeah. And in many respects he is, but he doesn't get beheaded.
Right.
So,
he survived.
Actually, he's the one that dies in his bed.
Right. Well, what's the other thing that we talk about a lot when it comes to Jane, her religion, right? We always see her as the one who was the most like Catherine of Aragon, right? What's your impression?
Yeah, so I think that's a myth. And I've sort of been working on that chapter actually on the book recently.
Okay.
And I think it comes out of a desire to compare her to Anne Boleyn. You know, Anne's the outspoken one, Jane's the meek and mild one, Anne's the attractive one, Jane's the dowdy one, Anne's the Protestant one, so Jane's the Catholic one. And actually, neither Anne's not Protestant, Jane's not Catholic. Well, everyone's Catholic, of course, because that means universal church. But she's not the religious conservative that she's been painted as in any way, shape, or form. And I mean, look at her brothers.
Right.
You know, this is a woman that has been at least raised with these people that will become very staunchly Protestant. I'm not in any way saying that I've got evidence that she's a Protestant. I don't. And there aren't really Protestants at this stage, but she's not the religious conservative that she's painted at. I mean, the BBC series, they call her, from the 70s, Henry VIII calls her his little nun. No.
Oh my gosh. I often wondered that too. Like, how could she be so Catholic when everybody else in her family was reformists, really?
I would say she's a Christian humanist. So she's calling for reform potentially, but within the church. She's not calling for a new church. But actually, you know, Erasmus is a Christian humanist. Thomas More is a Christian humanist, but also Thomas Cranmer is a Christian humanist. And, you know, actually, they can fall on all sides of the religious spectrum. She dies too early for us to actually know where she'll fall. Yeah. And I wouldn't be shocked if she didn't fall anywhere near the Catholic side of the spectrum. But, you know, she's dead, so you can't tell.
I know. It's so sad that her reign was so short, because what could have been, right?
She's a life cut short. And that's really what I want to bring out with Jane is, you know, she dies. There's a lot of promise there. She undoubtedly would have been Edward's regent. She's named as Edward's regent in the second act of succession. If the king dies leaving a minor son as heir, then the mother will become regent. So she would have been Edward's regent. And I think we'd have a completely different conception of Jane had she survived into Edward's reign. And it's the fact that she dies that she vanishes.
Yeah. Well, the fact that she would have been named regent shows how capable she must have been.
Yeah. I mean, Henry knows her, you know, when this act is passed. So absolutely. And again, you know, there are hints of her political activity. She talks to Chapuis, seems to do quite a credible job there. Princess Mary bringing Princess Mary back is a political activity. Her involvement, you know, when she tries to intercede for the rebels in the Pilgrimage of Grace, political activity. She's definitely a political queen. And Henry clearly thinks she's capable.
I love that you're bringing out this side of her. Do you get any idea of what her personality was like?
So we don't have any instance of recorded speech from Jane, contemporary ones. There are a few later accounts, but they tend to be 17th or even 18th century, so they are of dubious validity. We've got there are loads of copies of her letter announcing the birth of Edward, but they're all the same letter. There are otherwise 2 other letters, and one is just a buck grant where she's asking her park keeper to give some bucks to some boys in a choir. So no, we don't have the insight that we have into her characters we do with Anne Boleyn, because a lot of that comes from Eustace Chapuis, and his dispatches largely don't survive for Jane's reign. So it is about piecing together. You know, I can't tell you what she's thinking. And I'm going to be honest about that in the book, because I think that's really important too, to say this is a woman who largely doesn't have a surviving voice, but actually we can reconstruct. And I think that's really important. But no, in general, you can get a sense of Jane, but you can never quite get as close to Jane as you would like.
I'm going to ask you a question that is a historian. I know you're going to hate this. What do you think her personality may have been like?
Oh, yeah. So we're at the Wolf Hall event, so it's very,
yes.
We're very into our historical fiction. Yeah, I mean, she's ambitious. I do think she's quite kind. She takes on both her stepdaughters. She seems to have built relatively strong relationships with the people around her. Henry doesn't seem to have had many complaints about her as wife. Ambition, really, you can just see it through her story. I mean, how could you not be ambitious? I think she's very strong-willed, and I think she's very, very clever. You know, the submissive outer face, the bound to obey and serve. I think that really appealed to Henry at that stage. He'd been married to Anne Boleyn for 3 years. He wasn't liking the wife she turned out to be. I mean, I think it would have been fairly predictable that she was going to be outspoken, but he obviously didn't see it that way. So I think she's very, very clever, but I think she's playing the long game. She's going to wait out Henry. She's going to become regent if they have a child. If not, she's really bound herself to Princess Mary, who is probably heir to the throne at that stage in reality.
Yeah.
So she's playing the long game. It's just unfortunate she didn't have the time.
Yeah, for sure. So the question that we always hear, right, is who was pulling the strings? was Jane in control of her own destiny from the beginning, or was she being puppeteered by her brothers? Or
Yeah, she's definitely not being puppeteered. She is being coached, but you would expect that. I mean, she's being coached by Thomas Cromwell. She's being coached by Edward Seymour, particularly. Edward's quite a bit older than Jane, probably. I mean, I can't actually pinpoint her birth to any degree of certainty, but he's probably many years older than her. So of course she's being coached by these men, and she's Thomas Cromwell's candidate for Queen, partly because Henry has shown an interest, but he's definitely the one pushing her towards the throne.
Yeah.
But she's the one who has to do it. She's the one who has to be alone with Henry. She's the one who has to act out these scenes. Absolutely, it's her, and she must have wanted the queenship.
Yeah, she must have.
Yeah,
I love the idea that she's like her brothers, because I've always suspected that. Like, how can you be raised in this family with these people who are so ambitious? I mean, minus Henry, obviously. How can you be surrounded by these people and not have some of those similar traits?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're such an ambitious family, and they desperately want the power. And yeah, why wouldn't Jane be? And all of the hints that we have of her point in that direction.
Yeah,
she's much more Edward or Thomas than Henry.
I always like to imagine that her and Thomas were really good together as siblings.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're probably closest. If I had to guess, I'd guess she's possibly in between Henry and Thomas, or maybe they're. But I would guess that they are closer in age to her. I honestly can't pinpoint the birth order with the Seymours at all. I mean, they're obviously listed on the tomb, their father's tomb, but that's not always an entirely accurate source.
Right.
So I can't pinpoint it, but my guess is that she's closest in age to Henry and Thomas. And certainly when her jewels are being divided up after her death and gifts are being made to people that, the king knew she was close to, Henry gets the most, and then Thomas of the family.
Isn't that interesting? I think that says a lot, doesn't it?
It does. Edward doesn't get anything from the divvying up.
And I'm going to sidetrack a little bit to their mother, Marjorie Seymour, too. Even her will is kind of interesting. I don't know if you've looked at that at all. Even it almost seems like that one, too. And maybe I was misinterpreting it, but it looks like Edward was kind of snubbed in that as well. And is that just because he was the heir, or do you think it was more?
I mean, there is the family scandal with Edward's first wife. And that's a difficult one because obviously they're incredibly tight-lipped about it. Catherine Filial, his first wife, clearly was having an affair with somebody. I mean, Jane Dormer references it, in her biography, which is written by Henry Clifford. It may well be John Seymour. There's a little marginal note from the 17th century that says it was. The elder of his two sons by Catherine Filial does not get treated as a legitimate son by Edward in any shape or form. They're both removed from his inheritance, but the younger son is much more treated as a son. I mean, to the extent that, when he becomes Duke of Somerset, they should be Lord John Seymour and Lord Edward Seymour, but actually only the second one is ever called Lord Edward Seymour. As far as I can see, the eldest son is just Sir John Seymour, which is fairly telling, I would say.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. That piece of history, there's so many layers to it, isn't there? There's so much to look at. And when you look at Catherine and being a co-heiress to her father with her sister, and some of the speculation is that her father was mentally unwell, and that, maybe what he had said about her not being able to receive things was because of his mental status or something like that. There's always it's easy to poke holes.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. But my reading of it is I'd say there's enough evidence at least that she's been having an affair. It's not entirely certain it's John Seymour, but he's the only candidate that's named. There's another source that says that it's a gentleman of Edward's close acquaintance, which again is slightly pointing in that direction. If that scandal is true, and I would say it probably is, you can see how the family split and people fall on different sides. I mean, that's just like putting a bomb in the middle of the family, isn't it?
I just have such a hard time believing that it could have been John Seymour, because wouldn't that have sullied the Seymour name when Jane came to marry King Henry?
Yeah, I mean, but equally it may account for the fact that she doesn't seem to have had many suitors.
Good point.
Yeah, I mean, the only one we know of is, again, comes from Jane Dormer, where there was an attempt made by Francis Bryan to marry her off to Jane Dormer's father, and the Dormers are horrified. I mean, that doesn't suggest she was much of a catch, but to be honest, she wasn't much of a catch. The Seymours aren't that wealthy. She's got loads of brothers, so she's not going to inherit anything. There's not going to be a queue of men wanting to marry Jane Seymour. oddly Henry VIII does.
Right. Of anybody, it was the King of England who chose. Well, I guess it worked out pretty well for her, didn't it?
Yeah.
Well, Elizabeth, when do you think your book's going to be ready?
So it's not going to be for a while yet.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've got over a year till I have to hand in, but I may hand in a bit early. But so it's going to be a while. But
That's
it's going to be
exciting.
interesting.
I cannot
definitely make sure you
wait.
get a copy.
When it comes out, I will be first in line to get a copy because my obsession with the Seymours, and I'd love to be able to learn more about Jane because she is just such a curious figure that we don't know enough about. So thank you for all the research that you've done on her and that you are doing on her, because I think you are going to bring to light a part of her that we don't know.
I hope so. I want people to look at Jane in a different way, and particularly I don't want there to be all the hate, because she doesn't deserve it. And she's actually an interesting figure in her own right. And we don't need to look at her through the lens of Anne Boleyn.
I love that. Elizabeth, thank you for coming on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.